So first of all, I would like to thank Sujay and Samir for inviting me here and for this exciting conference. Second, I will begin with an apology that this talk will have no mock modular form or moonshine, at least not yet. Okay. So it will be on a completely different subject. Okay. So this will be based on the work done with Jan and Boris. Okay. And although the talk will be completely mathematical, I will not say anything about how we arrive at the formula. This conjecture that I will be trying to describe came from the study of multicentered black holes. Okay, but you will not see any black holes in the rest of the talk. So the purpose of this talk is to explain what the formula is, okay, without saying where we got it from, because as I said, it's still a conjecture and it's not even at a level where there is a physicist proof for this conjecture. Okay. So it will be a completely it will be thought of as just as a proposal, okay, and we will see what it means. So let me begin by recalling what quivers are. So a quiver is essentially a collection of nodes and arrows. So collection of nodes and arrows. So let me draw the nodes first. So nodes, we have a set of nodes. Suppose there are k nodes altogether, okay, I equal to 1 to k, where this is a number of nodes. Now specifying a quiver requires specifying two numbers associated with every node. So the first number is an integer which will take to be positive or 0. Okay. Now I am allowing ni to be 0, but ni equal to 0 basically means that that node is not there. So it is equivalent to saying that the node is not there. Okay. And the other one is what is called the fi parameter. This is real. Okay. So this we normally call the rank or the dimension, and this we call the fi parameter, phi Laplace parameter. Mathematicians call this the stability parameter, okay, the zeta I, and sometimes the ni is called the dimension. So this is the first set of data that we need to specify a quiver, okay, the number of nodes as well as an integer and a real number associated with every node.
This cannot be complex? Or
which one, zeta?
No,
No, zeta is real. We take zeta to be real. Okay. The second set of numbers that we need are that for every pair ij with I not equal to j, there is an integer gamma ij. Okay. So this integer gives us the number of nodes, number of arrows between the nodes. Okay. So if gamma ij is positive, okay, and it satisfies antisymmetry relation, so gamma ij is minus gamma gi. Okay. So if gamma ij is positive, okay, this means that there are gamma ij arrows from I to j, and if gamma ij is negative, this means that there are gamma gi which is minus gamma ij arrows.
cannot be 0.
No, it can be 0 also, then there are no arrows. Yeah. So the quiver can certainly have situations where there are no arrows from between the nodes.
And you don't permit an arrow to start and end.
Yeah, so we don't allow arrow to start and end on the same node, that's why I is not equal to j. Okay. Neither do we allow arrows to go from I to j and j to I. Okay, there are quivers of that kind, Okay. But we will assume well, there is a condition that I will be describing later, which is a genericity condition, okay, that if there are arrows going from I to J and J to I, we just take the difference. Okay, we just remove any arrow that goes between back and forth between nodes.
How about loops of longer length? You allow that?
Yes, loops of longer length will allow. Okay, it's only the loops of length 2 that we don't allow.
But what undirected edges? Undirected edges?
No, there are no undirected edges, so all arrows are directed. Okay, that's why the gamma j is antisymmetric, so it keeps track of whether the arrow is going from I to J or J to I. Okay, so this is what a quiver represents. Okay. Now, I have to associate a moduli space with it. Okay. This moduli space arises naturally in the study of supersymmetric n equal to 1 supersymmetric gauge theories with quiver gauge groups, but I will describe it in more abstract terms. So, for every ij, so the first thing is that for every ij with gamma ij positive, introduce a set of complex variables. Which is phi, which I will denote by phi ij alpha s s prime. Okay, I will explain what these indices are. Okay. So, alpha runs from 1 to gamma ij. S runs from 1 to n, ni, 1 to ni, and this transforms in the fundamental representation of uni. And this variable runs from 1 to nj, okay, and this transforms in the anti-fundamental of unj. Okay. So, these are not fields, these are just complex variables, okay. But for every pair ij there are several complex variables, okay, gamma ij, ni, nj number of complex variables. Okay. So, another way of saying this is that for every arrow in the quiver we introduce a complex variable, a set of complex variables in the bifundamental representation of the nodes that the quiver connects, right, because you can see that this alpha running from 1 to gamma ij means for every arrow there is a field, there is a variable like this, okay, and the variable transforms in the bifundamental representation of the groups uni that is associated with the nodes. So, this is going to be the parent space, okay. This is the manifold in which we are going to embed the quiver moduli space. This is of course just a product of complex manifolds. Yes, that is what I mean in the context of B branes, that is the way it appears, right. You can think of these as stacks of branes, okay, n1 branes of this kind, n2 branes of that kind, and these variables are like the fields that represent open strings going from one to the other.
In that context, what is the meaning of not allowing multiple this gamma j is like
So yeah, so you just cancel. So if the arrow is going back and forth, right, then you can give them a mass. There is a super invariant mass term that you can add, right, and in the limit mass goes to infinity, that simply decouples. Okay. Because you are looking at the low energy limit, okay, in the context of gauge theory, these arise in the study of low energy limits. Okay. So any massive object will simply decouple, any massive field. So these are like the chiral fields which remain, okay, which cannot get mass easily. Okay. So the last data about the quiver is a superpotential. So introduce a superpotential okay, so a superpotential for us will be a holomorphic function W of all the set of variables phi ij alpha st, okay. And what we require of this superpotential is that it should be gauge invariant, a gauge invariant polynomial.
Gauge group is the U and I.
Yes. Okay. I should have written it that way. Okay. So with this, we are ready to describe quiver moduli space. Okay. So the quiver moduli space is obtained by putting several restrictions on these variables phi.
Do you permit multi-trace?
Pardon?
Multi-traces any in the superpotential?
Yes, generically as long as it's gauge invariant, it's fine, right? So you can take products of phi's and take the trace basically. Okay. But you can also see that if there is no loop, then there is no gauge invariant polynomial because it has to close, right, by the requirement of gauge invariance. Okay. So now quiver moduli space. Okay. It's obtained as a result of several conditions, as I said. The first one is what is called the F term constant. Well, in physicist language, it's the F term constant, which is simply that del W del phi ij alpha SS prime equal to 0. Okay. This has to be true for every ij, alpha, S and S prime. Second condition is what we call the D term constant. Okay, which takes the following form. I should have put some qualification here. This is those j's for which gamma ij equal to 0. Gamma ij is positive. Otherwise, this doesn't make sense. Right? Phi ij exists only if gamma ij is positive. Okay. So minus sum over j. Okay. These are the ones for which gamma ij is less than 0. There is a star here. I forgot the star. Okay, this looks a little complicated, but it's not. Basically what you do, so TIAs are the generators of the UNI gauge group. Okay, A runs from 1 to Ni square. Okay. Physically what this is saying is the following, okay, that take any one of the generators of this UNI gauge group, okay, which we call TIA, okay, and then sum over all variables which transform under the generator, okay, with the condition that you take like phi star the generator times phi. Okay, this is essentially the action of the generator on this field, on this variable.
For each A, is it?
For each A, this has to be true for each A, for every A, okay, and for every I. Okay. So for each of the generators of UNI, you impose this condition, okay, that phi star T phi is equal to 0. Okay. So here you sum over all fields which are charged under this generator, which is basically these.
Your T is being summed over as well, right? Secretly.
Yes, T is also being summed over. Yeah, you are right. Thank you. Okay. Because basically the point is that the T index here, the S prime index, for example, is neutral under this. Okay, that's why it's just S prime, S prime. Here, the S prime index again is neutral under the UNI. Okay, that's why it's just S prime, only S index is sensitive to TI. Okay. The S prime index, of course, will come when you take Tj. Okay, then that will contract the S prime indices. Okay. So these are essentially what you will get as a D term constant. If you are written on a supersymmetric n equal to 1 supersymmetric gauge theory in 3+1 dimensions, okay, with this superpotential and this gauge group, then this is exactly what you will call the D term constants. These are the Fayolopoulos parameters.
There is no U1 which
Well, there is a U1 because UNI, each UNI contains a U1, okay, but otherwise you can take Ni equal to 1. If some of the Ni's is equal to 1, then it's U1. Okay, but other than that also each UNI contains a U1 factor.
right hand side will exist only for those U1s, right?
Only for?
Only the U1 part of break up as you end with U1 and S.
Yes, exactly. The UNI generators of course have 0. Okay. So now there is one more condition which I should have written down earlier, which I should write now. Which is this, sum over I, Ni zeta I should be 0. Okay, this is with the understanding that if you take the U1 generator here of the UNI, then the trace will declare as Ni. Okay, so you normalize the U1 generator so the trace is Ni. Okay. And the reason that we need this condition is because if you add up all these contributions for all I, then you can easily check that the left hand side vanishes. Okay. So it better be the right hand side also vanish. Okay, otherwise there are these equations have no solution. So you need this.
Different language is the center of mass.
Yes, this is the center of mass E1. Okay, because none of the fields are really charged under the center of mass E1. Okay, so this is the second condition. The third condition is that we take the quotient of this space by product over I UNI. Okay. This simply means that you find a set of solutions of the F and the D term constants, okay, and then two solutions which are equivalent under UNI transformation will be declared to be the same. Okay, so you count not all solutions to these equations, but only gauge inequivalent solutions. Are there any questions? Okay, so this describes Quiver moduli space. Okay, this is what we mean by the moduli space of this quiver. Okay. And I mean, it's expected, although it has, I don't know of a proof, that one expects that if the superpotential W is sufficiently generic, okay, which means that if it contains sufficient set of terms in it, okay, then this moduli space is compact. Okay. Otherwise, in general, the moduli space may have directions in which the sum of the phi i's become infinite, okay, and hence it is not compact. But one expects that for sufficiently generic superpotential, the f term constraints, okay, are sufficiently strong so as to make this space a compact space. Okay. And I will be working only under that assumption the superpotential that has been chosen is sufficiently generic so that this space is compact.
Should we also worry about gauge anomaly?
This is, see, we are not doing a quantum field theory, right? This is just a mathematical problem, right? These are just ordinary variables. So if you are doing quantum field theory, okay, say in 3+1 dimension, then you have to worry about gauge anomalies. Yeah, you have to make sure the total thing is anomaly free. But right now we are just setting up as a mathematical problem. This is a classical model. As I said, if you want to see what interpretation it has for 3+1 dimensional gauge theory, these are the classical moduli space, where you don't worry about any anomalies. Okay. But right now we just think of this as a mathematical problem where we want to study this moduli space. Okay. Now there are various reasons why this moduli space is interesting. One, of course, as I said, is the classical moduli space of supersymmetric gauge theories. Okay. But it also happens to arise in the counting of states in BPS states in n equal to 2 supersymmetric gauge theories in 3+1 dimensions. Okay. There are many examples where the Kuivers count the states of such theories. Okay. And it is also of interest to mathematicians because it plays some important role in the representation theory, okay, about which I will not say anything. So now it is clear from this construction that this is a holomorphic constraint, right. So this naturally induces a complex structure in the resulting manifold that you get by imposing this constraint. These two, this constant as well as this quotienting, okay, looks real, right. So if you just take it as a on its face value, it would look like that this is a real manifold rather than a complex manifold, because we had a complex structure to begin with because the phi's are complex variables. This preserves a complex structure, but these two together seem to destroy the complex structure. At least there is no natural complex structure that you can see in these two. Okay. But it turns out that 2 plus 3 together, okay, indeed can be gives a complex manifold. Okay. So while neither 2 nor 3 individually will lead to a complex manifold, 2 plus 3 is equivalent to quotienting by a complex gauge group and this makes Kuiver moduli space is a complex manifold. Yes, essentially the same gauge group complexified. Exactly.
With the GIT quotient, that's what
Yeah.
So when you said this is related to BPS state counting, what exactly is the relation?
Because sometimes in the counting of BPS states, right, you can think of the configuration as a Kuiver, right. What you can show is that the number of the essentially the cohomology, the Hodge numbers of this Kuiver moduli space, okay, actually count BPS states in n equal to supersymmetric gauge theories. Right. For a given gauge, for a specific gauge theory, you get specific Kuivers. That's the way this problem arises there.
and the NIs are the charges.
NIs are the charges, yeah. I mean, this will become more explicit, I think, once I introduce a different set of notations to level Kuivers. Okay. So our goal, so let's call this M. Okay, so we will denote the quiver moduli space by M, okay, and our goal is to compute. Well, we will not do any computation, we will just write down a formula. Hodge numbers HPQ of M.
Sorry, just a reference question. So, where is it explained? As in, where this counting problem has to do with this base theory?
The N equal to 2 supersymmetric?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is by in various recent papers by Vafa and his collaborators. You will find this connection.
But it's there in the even Mike's papers in the early days.
That is true, yeah.
Appendix of
Yeah.
that O minus C3 mod Z3 examples.
Yeah, I think these recent papers make it more versatile, right? I mean, they have a wide class of gauge theories, N equal to supersymmetric gauge theories, where they map the problem of counting states to counting cohomology of quivers, quiver moduli spaces. Okay, so this is our goal, but before we go there, you have to, we'll introduce some notations, okay, which makes things clear. So, first we introduce a k-dimensional real vector space. This is abstract k-dimensional real vector space, okay, and we take the basis vectors are in one-to-one correspondence with the nodes. Okay. So, these I will denote by gamma I, okay, I running from 1 to k. Okay, that is completely abstract vector space. To every node we associate a basis vector.
Use of gamma again.
I have used up gamma. Where did I use up gamma?
But okay.
Yeah, no, the same gamma. We'll see.
Gamma ij.
Yes, that is gamma ij, but this is gamma I. So these are vectors. Those are numbers, right? So 2 index will correspond to numbers. So there will be no confusion. I mean, single index will be vector, 2 index will be numbers. Okay. So now, given 2 vectors, gamma equal to sum over I ui gamma I, and gamma prime, which is sum over I ui prime gamma I. Okay. We introduce 2 bilinear products, gamma gamma prime. Okay. This is defined as sum over ij gamma ij ui u prime j, okay, and gamma dot gamma prime is the usual inner product sum over I ui vi. Ui prime, thank you. Okay. So this is symmetric, this is antisymmetric, right, because gamma ij was an antisymmetric matrix. Now, take a quiver of rank n1 to nk and fi parameters zeta 1 to zeta k. Okay. With this we associate two vectors. One we call the charge vector, and zeta, which is sum over I. Okay. And in this notation, sum over I in I zeta I equal to 0 essentially means that gamma dot zeta equal to 0. Okay. So we represent the quiver now as a pair of vectors in this k dimensional vector space. Okay. The first vector is a dimension vector. This tells you what is the rank of the various groups that we have, and the second vector is a real vector. This labels the phi of those parameters. Gamma plus is a set of vectors of the form and in an integer. Okay. So the first vector always belongs to gamma plus, right, because each of these ni's are integers which are either 0 or positive. Okay, so the gamma plus is just a subset. It's sort of in a lattice because it's like a cone, okay, in the original vector space. Okay, a cone inside in a lattice in the original vector space. So, M gamma zeta will be the moduli space of this quiver. Okay. And now we define Q, which is a function of gamma, zeta, and two variables y and t as D is the complex dimension of the moduli space. Okay. So, essentially Q encodes information about the Hodge numbers. Right? It is exactly the same information. Knowing Q, you can figure out what the Hodge numbers are and vice versa. Okay, so Q is in a sense a generating function of the Hodge numbers.
So this does this depend on the superpotential?
Yes, it in general depends on the superpotential. Okay. But as I said, we will be working with a generic superpotential, okay, and we will write down a formula for such generic superpotentials, and we will see where the possible dependence on the superpotential should come from. I am going to compute.
The dimension of moduli space.
Yes, the dimension of the moduli space will automatically come Q. If you know Q, right, it automatically gives you what the dimension of the moduli space is, because the maximum negative power of y is the dimension of the moduli space. Right, because P and Q are of course always positive. Yeah, so Q contains not only information about the Hodge numbers but also about the dimension of the moduli space. Okay, now one important point to notice that if we calculate q at a spatial value gamma zeta, if we set y as v to the half and t as v to the minus half, then this is as an easy algebra to show that this becomes minus 1 to the d v to the minus d by 2 okay. Now this quantity is an index. Okay. In fact, this is what appeared in the Acton stock yesterday, okay, in the context of Calabi-Yau. This is an index, okay, and often this quantity is much easier to calculate than the full Hodge numbers. Okay. In fact, this is always given by a local integral of some combination of the Riemann tensors, okay, and you can perform this local integral. And there is a recent paper, okay, by Lee, Wang and E, where they proposed a formula for calculating this. Okay. So the point that I want to emphasize is that this number, okay, is often easier to calculate, okay, than the Hodge numbers themselves. Okay. And I emphasize this because in the final formula that we will write down, okay, for the Hodge numbers, okay, or for Q, okay, we will need some of these data as input. Okay. We will not be able to determine all the terms that appear in that, but yeah, as long as you know these, okay, as long as you know, this is what we call chi. Hirzebruch index chi m zeta v. Okay. So as long as you know these, okay, our formula will give the complete result for all the Hodge numbers. The other thing to notice is that if we set in this formula t is equal to 1, okay, then this q basically counts the Betti numbers, okay, because then if you set q equal to 1, it is only sensitive to p plus q, okay, so it will give the Betti numbers. And then if you further set y equal to 1, that is the Euler character. Okay. So we will be giving you a formula for q, okay, but not directly a formula for q. I have to introduce one more notation before I can give the formula. So I define again, this is the definition, q bar, okay, this is sometimes called the rational invariant, gamma zeta yt okay, where this symbol m divides gamma basically means that m should be a factor of gamma. Okay. So if we replace gamma as a sum of the lattice vectors, okay, the gamma I basis, okay, each of the ni's, okay, that appeared there should contain m as a factor. So in particular, if gamma is primitive, if there is no common factor between all the ni's, then the only term that in the sum that contributes is m equal to 1, okay, and then you can say that q bar and q are the same. Okay. This formula, you will see analog of this formula appearing again and again, okay, in this final formula, okay. And physically, okay, this arises in converting a problem involving Bose or Fermi statistics to a problem involving Boltzmann statistics. Okay. So it turns out that if you use q as the input, okay, and then use the Bose or Fermi statistics, that is equivalent to using q bar as the input and using Boltzmann statistics. Okay, that is physically the reason why it arises, but for now you just take this as a definition. Okay. If gamma is primitive, then q bar and q are the same.
Q bar is given, can we invert this and give
Yes. So that is the next relation I am going to write down. So the inverse is also, so inverse relation q bar gamma zeta yt is sum m divides gamma. It is almost the same formula except that there is this mu m which comes in. Sorry, this is q. Okay, I have to define what this mu of m is. This is the Mobius function. So mu of m is 1 if m is a product of even number of distinct primes. Okay, we will not count 1 as a prime, so greater than equal to 2. Okay. This is equal to minus 1 if m is a product of odd number of distinct primes greater than equal to 2 and it is 0 otherwise. Okay. So essentially if it contains a prime factor more than once, okay, like if m equal to 4 then the mu m is 0. Okay, that is the definition of mu m. Now you can show that this relation implies this and vice versa.
So when you say odd number of those distinct primes, or if it's just only one factor, that's also counted.
Yes. So 2, mu of 2 for example will be minus 1, right. Mu of 6 will be plus 1 because it contains 2 times 3. Okay. Mu of 18 will be 0 because it contains like 2 times 3 square, right. So 3 appears more than once. Okay. So it is not a product of distinct primes. So mu of 18 will be 0. Okay. So this formula is just to show that if we know q bar, you can reconstruct q and vice versa. Okay. For primitive gamma, okay, q bar is equal to q from both sides, okay, because mu of 1 is just 1. No, this inversion formula always holds. I mean, I think you can show that starting from this you can go back. It does not require any property of q. I mean, the fact that there should be an inversion formula, you can easily guess, right? Because imagine that you start with a primitive gamma, okay, for which q bar and q are the same. Now if you take 2 gamma, it is given by a linear combination of q of 2 gamma and q of gamma, but q of gamma you already know in terms of q bar of gamma, right. So you can use that to express q of 2 gamma instead of q bar of gamma and q bar of 2 gamma.
It's a multiplicative function. It's a multiplicative function for that argument.
Multiplicative function.
That means if you know 2 gamma, you will write.
Yeah, if you know the q bar of 2 gamma, right, what I am saying is that to know q of 2 gamma, right, you need information about both q bar of 2 gamma and q bar of gamma. It is a linear combination of q bar of 2 gamma and q bar of gamma, and the fact that there should be such a relation you can see also directly from here by solving this.
You were mentioning that the q is like some kind of a Fermi statistics and the q bar is some kind of Boltzmann statistics.
Yeah, meaning if q is the object that you use to count things, okay, which obey Fermi or Bose statistics, that is a real thing. Okay. But the reason that q bar is useful is because you can convert this problem to a problem involved where the q bar is apparently the number, okay, and those objects obey Boltzmann statistics.
That point of view, Boltzmann statistics doesn't necessarily imply a Fermi statistics.
Yeah, so Boltzmann statistics and Fermi statistics of course quite different, okay, but for these objects, okay, if you the real thing is Fermi or Bose statistics, right? So q obeys Fermi or Bose statistics, but q bar is useful because in terms of q bar you can behave as if the particles obey Bose statistics, right? That's the way we solve the black hole multi-center black hole quantum mechanics problem.
And I can think in the same way for the second formula also, but Q bar is some of the Boltzmann statistics and the.
No, it's our q bar is always, yeah, q bar is the Boltzmann statistics and it converts it to Bose or Fermi statistics. Okay. But again, that's just just an aside, right? As a formula, these are just concrete formula.
But it seems to suggest that, I don't know, the Stackman will be able to tell from looking at the Boltzmann statistics whether it came as a classical limit of a Fermi system.
The point is this requires some additional input, right? That these are not exactly free particles, but their interaction has a very specific form of Landau level motion, right? And that was needed to go back and forth. So if you have an arbitrary interacting system, you may not will probably not be able to do this. Yes.
So it's black hole quantum problem with n equals 2 theories. What is the superpotential playing over there? Because you usually
Yeah, there of course the superpotential is generic. You don't know what superpotential it is because quantum corrections and supergravity corrections will generate arbitrary superpotential of these because they are the z these phi's are like open string states between the d blends, right? And in general there will be coupling between various open strings which will generate superpotential.
n equals 2, I thought this confused, stupid confusion. So n equals 1 gauge series, I understand.
Yeah, but the point is that you are counting 1/4 BPS black hole or half BPS black holes in n equal to 2. Okay. So the effective supersymmetry of the quantum mechanics is n equal to 1 for supercharges. So that dynamics will have superpotential. Not that the theory will have superpotential. Is the dynamics of the black holes. Yeah, half BPS objects which have a superpotential. Okay, so now we are going to give the formula. Okay, so this is essentially the punchline. So the formula for q bar takes the following form. I will try to explain the various parts of this formula. Well, that's a long story, so I am not going to tell you that. So I have to explain various formulae. Let me give the omega. Okay, omega I will give you in the next other slide. So Ci so this is a similar. Okay, so this sum okay. So let me explain, and then I'll write down the rest of the formula which is missing. So let's start from here. okay, n greater than or equal to 1. This is the, so basically this sum represents the number of ways you can take a vector gamma, okay, which was a member of the lattice, and you can divide it up into sum of subvectors, okay, sum of other lattice vectors, okay, but all of them will have to have a positive coefficient. Okay, that is why alpha I should belong to gamma plus, and the sum should be equal to gamma. Then there is a symmetry factor. Okay, so let me explain the symmetry factor. So this LS basically corresponds to if L1 of the alpha i's are identical, say equal to beta 1. Okay. L2 of the alpha i's are identical, say equal to beta 2, etc. Okay. With the constraint, of course, the sum over Li, Ls should be equal to n. Okay. The total number of alpha i's is n. Okay. Then that is the factor. Okay. So if all the alpha i's that if you have taken the vector gamma and split into a set of alpha i's which are all distinct, then this factor is just 1. Okay, that is what this
So n is the number of vectors into which the big vector is being
is splitting, right. Now of that set n, right, it could happen that some of those are identical, right. So though that factor is this 1 over Ls factorial, okay, product over L. So you basically take into account the symmetrization in those factors. So that's this is a symmetry factor. This one is a known function. Okay, it's a known function of its arguments, okay, and it's determined by a set of iterative relation. So g of a given set of arguments is given in terms of g of one less number of set of arguments and so on. Okay, I could write it down, but it's a little long story, so we'll see how much time we have at the end, okay, to see if we can write it. Okay. Here I think this is self-explanatory. There is a product of n terms, okay, which multiplies this. Okay. So you can think of, okay, physically you can think of this, okay, as if it's counting the degeneracy or the index from n-centered configurations, okay, and these are contributions from each center. Okay. You are taking the product of the contribution from each center, that is in this product of I equal to 1 to n. Okay. And you again see that this factor has appeared, okay, because this is needed to go from the Boltzmann to from the Boas-Formel statistics to Boltzmann statistics. Okay. I have to explain what this is. Okay. So that I am going to write down in the next formula. You see that alpha is, of course, I have explained. Ci's are real numbers, they are just given by, this is the dot product. Okay, I had introduced the dot product earlier. So the Ci's are just zeta dot alpha I.
So G comes from degeneracy of.
Yeah, so G comes from just the degeneracy of the n-centered quantum mechanics, right? And these are the degeneracies of individual centers. I mean, that's a physical way to look at this formula. These h are again known functions. Okay, I can give it to you later, but for now I just get this. What are the omega s? These are the unknowns. Okay, so our formula is written in terms of these unknowns. Okay. So let us see what we have gained. Okay. So here we have a function. Okay. Forget about zeta for now. Okay. We have a function of two variables. For every gamma, okay, there is an unknown function of two variables. Okay. What we have gained is that we have expressed this, okay, for every gamma in terms of an unknown function of one variable t. Okay. Now, in principle, these we can compute if we know the index. Okay. So, if we set y equal to t inverse in this formula, okay, we re-express this in terms of the omega ss, okay, and so if you know the index, okay, there is precisely as much information in the index as we need, okay, because you need a set of unknown functions of one variable, and index precisely gives you that for every gamma. These physically, okay, are what we call the single centered degeneracies or single centered index. Okay, in the context of black hole counting, these are the ones which appear as degeneracies of single centered black holes. Okay. And this big formula, okay, converts the contribution from a single centered black hole into the multi centered contribution.
So can I ask a
Yes.
So there are several studies of modular spaces of gauge theories with n equals 1 supersymmetry.
Yes.
Coming from Tony Calabia and so on. Can you just fix these by taking those as data points?
Yeah, the point is that the omega ss could in principle depend on the choice of the superpotential. Okay. So, for the generic so this is the formula which is expected to valid for a generic superpotential. If the superpotential is non-generic, then this could also start getting y dependence. Okay. Then you don't gain very much. What you gain there is you can still determine the dependence on zeta, okay, the Fayol-Apollos parameters. Okay. So, this essentially means that if we know the result in one chamber, okay, we can get the result in all chambers, but it's not very I mean it's not as powerful, okay, as you would get for a generic superpotential. So yes, for if you have a generic superpotential, okay, omega s's are fixed. Okay.
So you would say that if we give you a twin-peak Calabia,
Yes.
I mean, I can deform it. That is generic enough.
Yes, I think if you deforming it is generic enough, right? Exactly. So it will give you in terms of omega s. Okay. Then you can compute the omega s's if you know the index. Okay, which is computed by local integral on this Calabia.
Interpretation of omega is in the gauge theory context.
Well, there is no direct interpretation of omega s in the gauge theory context. Okay. Well, I'll say a few more words about omega s. Right. For quivers, the omega s's are non-zero in some cases, but roughly for some basis vectors, omega. Okay, let me write down the constant of omega s, then it will become clear. Okay. So as I said, g and h I have not given you, but these are completely known functions. Okay, there is a well-defined algorithm for computing g and h. So omega s, although we don't know explicitly, okay, there are various conditions on omega s, okay, under which it vanishes. So let me write the vanishing conditions.
So you said that if you know the index, you know the function omega completely, right?
Yes, if you know the index, of course you know the function omega complete. Then these results are consistency checks on the formula. Okay, so even without knowing the index, right, at least something you can say about omegas. So omega s of gamma I is 1. Okay, so for the basis vectors, it's always 1. Omega s of a gamma I plus b gamma j equal to 0 for a b positive. Oh, I should have said a 1a. Omega s of a gamma I is 0 for a greater than or equal to 2. Okay, a, b are here integers.
Because it's like a bounce rate of 2.
Yeah, it's like a bound set of two things. Two things cannot bind, right? You need at least three things to bind. Third condition is a little more complicated. So let's take omega s of sum over I n I gamma I.
Is there any condition on that there is no arrow between I and j, nothing?
No, nothing. So omega s a gamma I plus b gamma j is always 0, right? That's because if you take two centers, right, there may be arrow between them, but they don't form what is called a scaling solution. Okay, that they think centers cannot come close to each other. So there is no single centered contribution. Everything is writable in terms of multi-centered, which is already captured by the formula. So this one has a little complicated vanishing condition. Okay, so consider the following set. So this corresponds to n1, n2 and so on. Okay, so basically think of this as a set of multiple configurations, each made of n1 number of gamma 1s, n2 number of gamma 2s and so on. Okay. So if we can divide this into two sets, such that okay, this immediately implies that for quivers with no loops, omega s is all the non-trivial omega s are all 0, okay, except for this one. Okay, because if the quiver has no loops, you can always divide this set into two parts. Okay. So this basically means that you have to divide this set into two parts, A and B, okay, two sets A and B, so that all the arrows are directed from A to B, okay, or B to A, but that doesn't matter because you can declare the B as A and A as B. Okay, under such condition, omega s again vanishes. Okay. There are more complicated vanishing conditions on omega s. Okay. For example, if you have for a three-centered configuration, okay, omega s vanishes unless gamma 1, 2, gamma 2, 3 and gamma 3, 1 satisfies the triangle inequality, okay, which is a more complicated algebraic condition, but there are many such vanishing conditions which are there, which you can use to set many of these omega s to 0. Okay. But a generic omega s, okay, is not 0. No, omega s is only single centered, right. You see the existence of omega s, okay, by saying that the multi-centered configurations can come close, okay, because you know that the black holes exist only when the scaling solutions exist, right. So you test the existence of omega s by checking whether the things can come close, but omega s is generally in a single centered contribution, right. So the fact that omega s doesn't depend on y, okay, is a reflection of the fact that the single centered black holes all have zero angular momentum. Okay, because this y is essentially conjugate to the angular momentum quantum number. T, there is no direct interpretation of T in the black hole quantum mechanics, right. So initially, in fact, our original analysis was for T equal to 1. Okay. Then we put it in because in the context of quiver quantum mechanics, mechanics, there is a natural quantum number. So T you can think of as some other global quantum number, which is floating around, which basically flows smoothly through. Right. The multi-centered dynamics is not affected by T. You can see that neither H nor G has any dependence on T. Right. So all the non-trivial dynamics actually is y dependent. Okay. G is also a function of y only. So T is just some other global quantum number which may exist in the problem.
And the other charges of the black hole are all in gamma.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
These conditions on omega, they are supposedly all omega are functions of T also, right?
Yes, omega is a function of T. But okay, so these are functions of T. So as a function of T, it's just 1. Right? So basically, there is no dependence on T. these conditions. Okay, as I said, that this, I mean, the way it comes, okay, is by looking at the, by studying multi-centered configuration and seeing under what condition the centers can come close. Okay, and for one can argue, show that omega s is non-zero only when the centers can come on top of each other. Okay, so this is the condition under which that can happen. Okay, or these are the conditions under which that cannot happen.
This formula is kind of like it's so important. It's not immediately obvious omega is somehow related to that.
Yes, that is true. Okay, because but the result is still true that omega s is related to single. That's how we derived it. Right? We didn't invent this formula from scratch. I mean, we started with single centered and then built up the formula. Right? But omega s is indeed related to a single centered black hole degeneracy.
So if you have an index, if you know the index, you can determine this function omega as a function of t.
Yes.
And once the omega, this function is determined, then like now this complete Hilbert is determined, and then you can go ahead and get the h.
That's right.
Omega
Yes.
inverse.
Exactly.
Okay,
That's the idea. Yeah. Okay.
So the ultimate purpose, or like now the what it's going to do is going to give you all the HPQ. Is it?
Yes. Well, the point is this is a purpose that I have emphasized here. Okay. But the at least for me, I mean, one of the reasons for this is that if one can verify or prove this formula, right, then that will tell us that our understanding of black hole mechanics is correct. Right, because we got this by by analyzing the black hole quantum mechanics. Right, so that will be a taste of our understanding of black hole quantum mechanics. Okay, now a few words about what kind of tests we have done. Maybe this, don't bring down the screen, but can we just switch is that on already? Because I will be using it in 5 minutes. So tests. Yeah, don't bring the screen. Projector is on, right? Okay. Okay. So first, for quivers without loops. Okay, this is due to Reinecke, has been around for a while, at least since 2000. Okay, and our formula agrees with it. Okay, so for quivers without loops, as I said, things are very simple because all the omega s's, okay, only this is non-zero, everything else is 0. Okay, so it's easy to well, it's easier to I mean see what the consequences are, and indeed it agrees with Reinecke formula in most generality. Okay, we didn't have to look at specific quivers. The second point is that it satisfies the Concevitt-Swaberman wall crossing formula. Okay, this is again a consistency check. So these two we have actually proven, okay, in the most general setting. Third, of course, just verification by in examples. Yes, the examples have loops. In fact, it doesn't make sense to test it in examples without loops because it's already proven, right? Yeah. So the examples have loops, okay, and you have checked that the results are correctly reproduced. Okay, and the fourth one is the following: that we know that this Quiver moduli space has what is called a mutation symmetry. Which one?
Mutations can be also thought of as.
Well, it's not exactly case wall crossing, because case wall crossing only changes the phi Laplace parameter. Mutation actually changes also the gamma ij's, okay, and the rank. So it's a more complicated transformation. It's an equivalence between two different quivers, right? So different gamma ij's and different ni's, whereas case wall crossing is only changing the zeta, keeping the rest fixed.
So I mean, when we guys did Calabi-Yau, we thought of going across the wall as changing the quiver.
Yeah, but that's not the kind of wall that, okay, you do, those are not walls of marginal stability, right? Yeah, okay. So that's why you change the quiver, okay. It's an exact equivalence, and then you follow the model right from there. Okay. So M has mutation symmetry. Okay, the rules are quite general. Okay, and while we have not proven that our formula is invariant under mutation, we have tested it in many examples. Okay, so in this case, we don't know the other side of the whether the other side of the result is correct. Okay, but what we have tested is that the formula itself satisfies mutation symmetry. Okay, so that's, I mean, a test that perhaps this formula is not completely crazy.
Not tested in this. Your formula is mutation symmetry.
No, we have not proven it. We have taken specific examples of mutation and tested it, right? But I believe that this is something we may be able to prove also. Okay, because the formula is general, mutation symmetry is quite well known. Okay, that the rules are quite well defined. So in principle, it is possible that maybe we can prove mutation symmetry, but we have not done it. Okay, we have just taken many examples and checked that the under mutation, okay, they gave the same result for Q.
Weird things happen. Sometimes you can have a situation where on one side you have superpotential, the other side there is.
Yeah, the point is because you are taking generic superpotential, okay, under mutation it will produce generic superpotential. Right? Yes, so if you have special superpotentials, this can happen. Right? You have to worry about how the superpotential transforms. But that's why if you have a generic superpotential, then you will always get a generic superpotential on the other side. Yeah, it sometimes converts a quiver with loop into the quiver without. Right? Yeah, and there we can check that our formula is actually valid. Okay, so now I think I go to the screen and I'll show you some simulation. So the point is I didn't tell you what the G and H are, right? But it's completely algorithm. There is a well-defined recursion relation which derives it. Okay. So this has now been coded. Okay. So here you can see an empty notebook. Okay. I have just saved it in a file. So I mean, in order to save time, I just have written it in a text file. I'll cut and paste. So here this is the input, we are putting the code in. So the code of course has many different functions, okay, but this is the main one which I am going to describe, which we call the Coulomb branch formula. Okay, so let me explain what this is. Okay, so this first entry is the gamma ij matrix. Okay, you can see it's an antisymmetric matrix of 3 by 3 antisymmetric matrix. Oh. Okay. Second entry is the phi Laplace parameters. Okay. Third entry is a dimension vector. Okay, it's a simple quiver. Okay, 1 1 1. Okay, and you can see that they add up to a 0. So this is the way the result comes. Okay, it's 1 plus omega s. Now omega is 1 1 1 because omega s has an argument gamma, right? And you see that there is a y which has appeared, but you can just drop the y. We kept this y to deal with more general cases, okay? But whenever omega s comes, it's only a function of t. Okay, so this is what you get for this simple quiver of rank 3, total rank 3. So here I take the same quiver, okay, but increase the rank. Okay, rank is now 2 to 1. Okay, and just to make sure that the phi Laplace parameters are satisfy the correct condition, I have that divided the first entry by 2 and second entry by 2. Okay, so that sum over ni zeta is still 0. I am not sure what is happening. My computer seems to be hanging. That's what I am doing. Yeah, it probably got scared of the. Let me get out and do it again. So, this is what you get for this 2 to 1. Okay, you can see the many 3 different omega s's which have appeared. Okay, but I should emphasize also that this the omega s 111 which appears here, okay, is the same omega s 111 which would have appeared if you had just calculated for 111. It's not that for every it doesn't depend on gamma, the original input variable. Okay, this is the same omega s. Okay, now I am going to give a rank equivalent with 4 nodes. Okay, so this is a gamma ij entry 4 by 4 matrix antisymmetric. This is a dimension vector. Okay, so total rank 6 as you can see, and this is the Fire-Laplace terms, and I evaluate it for this. So, it is going to take a little while, but not long. So, this is how to get. Okay, no y dependence, it is only dependent on t. So, if you have your favorite quiver, you can just put it in and check, or if you want an answer, you can just put it in and get the result from here. Okay, so I think I will stop here.
I missed the point where superpotential enters in your formula.
Superpotential does not enter, right. The only way it can enter is through the omega s's, right, which are unknowns, and if you take 2 different superpotentials, then in general in principle the omega s's could be different, right. So, but we do not see the superpotential effect directly in the formula for Q.
So omega s is a function of gamma and also m of gamma comma zeta.
No, omega s has no dependence on zeta, right. So, omega s can directly depend on W. See, W has certain parameters, right. Typically what happens when you vary the parameters continuously, omega s does not change, only under certain conditions that it can jump, because see, if you change W smoothly, right, you do not expect that the topological properties of the manifold to change abruptly, right, but there may be different classes of W's which give different topological properties. Those are encoded inside omega s. Okay. So, if for example you want the result for one particular W, okay, you take that W, calculate the index, okay, calculate the omega s from the index, and then you know that that is the correct omega s for that W. Right. If you change your W, right, you have to again recalculate the index and use that to calculate the recalculate the omega s's. So, that is the way omega s will the W dependence will enter, but you do not see it directly, okay, in the formula. Yes.
I thought you should get a term y power minus d by 2. If there is no y dependence, it means d is 0.
Yes, that is right.
That means the moduli space
Is a point, yeah, collection of points, exactly. Yes.
What are the possible loopholes to the physicist proof this formula?
I think there are many loopholes. I mean, the point is the way we got this is the following. I mean, I can say the main assumption that we had made. So, we had this dynamics of multi-centered black holes, okay, and you have to calculate an appropriate equivalent index for these multi-centered black holes. We converted this to a localization problem. So, it was an integral over the phase space of multi-centered black holes. It is 3-dimensional phase space, right. Each center can move in 3 dimensions. So we converted to we wrote down an integral over the phase space and then evaluated using localization technique. Okay. Now what happens is in the localization technique, the fixed points are just rotational invariant configuration. So they are correspond to centers lined along a line. Okay. So those are clean and you can easily evaluate it. Okay. But there are some other rotational invariant configurations which correspond to all the centers come together. Okay, those are the scaling solutions. Those are also rotational invariant, but those are not obtained as limits of solutions where they are aligned along a line. Okay. So the contribution from those we do not directly see from the standard analysis. Okay. So those we think of as corrections to the actual formula. And if you look at the classical angular momentum associated with those configurations, it is 0. Okay. So naively you would have thought that we just take them to be some fixed points with 0 value of the angular momentum. But that does not give sensible Poincare polynomial. Okay. What happens is the result that you get, okay, is not even a polynomial in Y and Y inverse. Okay. So we use what is called the minimal modification hypothesis, that it is not 0. Okay. That means if it is 0 then it is just a constant, but we say that it is some power of Y, but you try to minimize the angular momentum. Okay. So the minimum power of Y, okay, with which you can solve this problem is what is the correct answer. Okay. That is the hypothesis that we use. So those that in fact goes on into H, that in the calculation of H. So H is essentially the correction factor. So I said there are two functions are G and H, which are both determined. So G is the formula, the function that you get directly by this localization analysis. So that's quite clean. Okay. H is the correction factor because inside G we have not included the scaling solutions. Okay. So that's basically the loophole. Okay. We have assumed that the contribution to the scaling solutions, okay, the naive result does not make sense because that corresponds to 0 angular momentum. We have assumed that it's while it's not 0 angular momentum, okay, the corrections come with minimal possible angular momentum. So that's the assumption, okay, in this analysis, and it seems to work quite well for the quivers you have tested. Yes.
So if I take two quivers, say either the disjoint or the connected with one arrow, so and if I consider this whole thing as one big quiver,
Yes.
the Q bar for the big quiver, is it sort of in a simple in some simple fashion related to the Q bars of individual quivers?
Yes, if you take two quivers which are not connected by arrows, right, then there is a bound state. Okay. Basically, if there are disconnected quivers, okay, then the answer in this context I think will be 0. Like, yeah. Yeah, I think if you have disjoint quivers, then well, then it is just a product.
So and that comes out from your this formula, the big one with the
Yeah, I think it should come out from that formula. Yeah.
if they're connected by just one arrow, is there any signification?
No, no, not necessarily. When if you want to do explicit calculation, okay, then of course there is simplification because you have only one variable instead of many. Okay. But
So physically, like, is there a reason to expect any simple formula to exist when these two quivers are connected by one arrow?
But the omega S is related to the total charge will vanish.
omega s will vanish, yes, right? Because this, if they are connected by one arrow, right, or even multiple arrows, okay, as long as there is 2, the omega s will vanish, right? Because omega s requires at least 3 centers. So that is a simplification, and the formula for this is explicitly known, okay, which is a special case of Reinecke formula, where Reinecke's formula gives you the result for any quiver as long as it does not have a loop.
But you also imagine that each of those two blocks is itself a quiver with some arrows. Right?
Yeah,
That's the question.
that's it. Well, each of these, oh, you are saying that you have 2 sets and then they are connected by some arrow, is that the what?
That's what I meant.
Okay.
One quiver is on the whole complicated thing.
Yeah, it's possible that there is some simplification for this case.
But you can go crossing.
Yeah, the point is in this case, of course, we know that there is no omega s that connects has everything because it violates that other condition, right? The last condition, because there is a, you can divide it into 2 sets A and B, and arrows are all directed from A to B. Okay. So then there is no overall omega s, right? There is omega s inside and omega s inside. So it's possible that this factors into the product times something.
Just go crossing.
So
slow crossing would give the answer.
Yeah, yeah, because there is a one part where this is 0. Exactly.
One more
One-
question, then
yeah.
I'll take question. Right.
Can we apply this to n equal to 4 theorems where we know the answers? But the answer is not the same for
The point is in n equal to 4 theory, if we do directly, right, there are also fields, the variables which connect the node to itself, right. This doesn't include those. So what we will do for those is that you just you can add superpotential. We are using the n equal to 1 language, right. So you can add superpotential to just lift those away, right. Those are not consistent with n equal to 4 supersymmetry, but as far as the n equal to 1 is concerned, you can just give them mass. Okay. So we don't, because you are considering this generic superpotential, where anything that could get mass will become massive basically, right, in the n equal to 1 language.
And if you do that, then the answer is different. If you
I think the answer will be different. Sorry, Boris, you had something to say?
You were asking about n equal 4 diodes. Yeah. In that case, there are only two sets of potentials which can contribute. The more crossing formula is.
Okay, if you want a multi-centered configuration, yeah, that's of course trivial, because if you just have 2 centers, right, so the wall crossing just determines it, right. So it's like this situation that there is some blob here, and they are connected by this, right. So you can go to one region in the moduli space where this configuration doesn't exist, right. For some value of zeta, this configuration doesn't exist. So for any zeta, you can find the degeneracy by wall crossing, right. And as I said, the quiver formula of course satisfies the wall crossing formula.